Sword Art Online is complete garbage. The anime is a total dumpster fire, and the fictional game design is somehow even worse. Every good idea it stumbles into gets wasted. The story keeps acting like it's deep and serious, but most of the time it feels like it's making things up as it goes. The characters are either boring, annoying, or exist just to praise the main character. And don't even get me started on the game itself. If Sword Art Online were a real game, it would have crashed and burned on day one. The balance is a joke, the mechanics make no sense, and the whole thing feels like it was designed by someone who has never played an MMO in their life. Players somehow survive in a world packed with terrible systems that would make any real gaming community quit in frustration. The worst part is that the show wants you to believe this game is a huge achievement. It's not. It's a mess. Everything about it screams bad design. The anime keeps telling you how amazing the world is instead of actually showing it. By the end, you're left watching a story that's trying to convince you it's smart while tripping over its own nonsense every step of the way. It's pretty obvious the writer has never played an MMO before, and it feels like he didn't do even the most basic research. The way players act, the way the game is designed, and the way the community functions all come across like someone's idea of an MMO after hearing a 5-minute description from a friend. Real MMO players spend years finding exploits, breaking balance, creating guides, forming rivalries, and turning every system inside out. In Sword Art Online, people mostly just wander around and accept whatever nonsense the game throws at them. The show constantly expects the audience to believe that thousands of players are trapped in this world, yet it rarely feels like an actual online game populated by real people. There's barely any sense of the chaos, drama, greed, competition, and creativity that define MMO communities. Instead, it feels like a fantasy story wearing an MMO costume. The game isn't built like something people would actually play. It's built like a backdrop for the plot. You don't need to be an MMO veteran to notice the problems either. A few hours of research would have raised 100 questions about how this world is supposed to function. Instead, the series just hopes nobody looks too closely. The more you think about it, the more it falls apart. Anyone who plays MMOs should be insulted by how terrible Sword Art Online is. This is a show that's supposed to be made for MMO players, and yet it barely understands the first thing about the genre it's built around.
What makes everything even worse is that the show keeps acting like it's a love letter to gaming culture. It wants credit for understanding MMO players while getting basic things wrong over and over again. Anyone who's spent years raiding, grinding, trading, joining guilds, or watching entire server communities develop their own stories can see how fake all of this feels. Instead of capturing what makes MMOs special, Sword Art Online reduces the genre to a collection of surface-level ideas and power fantasies. The result is a show that seems aimed directly at MMO players while completely failing to understand why people enjoy MMOs in the first place. That's what makes it so frustrating. It's not just bad. It's bad at the one thing it was supposed to get right. The only people who think this show is good are people who are just as clueless about MMOs as the writer. If Sword Art Online is your idea of a believable online game, then you've probably never spent much time playing one yourself. The series throws around MMO terms, game mechanics, guilds, raids, and player killers, but it never understands any of them beyond the most surface-level version imaginable. To someone with little or no experience with online games, that might sound impressive. To actual MMO players, it looks like a train wreck. That's why so many of the show's biggest defenders tend to focus on the characters, the romance, or the action scenes instead of the game itself. The moment you start examining Sword Art Online as an actual MMO, the illusion falls apart. The systems don't make sense, the player behavior doesn't make sense, and the world only works when nobody asks questions. The show survives on people filling in the gaps themselves. If you already know how MMOs work, those gaps become impossible to ignore. What was supposed to be an immersive virtual world starts looking more like a fantasy setting with a few game menus glued on top. And once you notice that, it's hard to take any of it seriously. It makes you wonder why the writer decided to write a story about MMOs in the first place when he clearly doesn't have much experience with them and doesn't seem interested in understanding them. There are countless genres and settings he could have chosen, yet he picked one that requires knowledge of how online games and gaming communities actually work. Then he proceeds to get so many basic things wrong that it feels like the MMO aspect exists purely as window dressing. The strangest part is that MMOs are filled with interesting stories already. Guild politics, server rivalries, economy manipulation, race-to-world-first competitions, famous players, scammers, trolls, community events, and massive social networks. Real MMOs practically write stories for themselves. Yet Sword Art Online ignores most of what makes the genre unique and replaces it with generic fantasy tropes and an overpowered protagonist. It's hard not to feel like the MMO setting was chosen because it sounded cool, not because the writer had anything meaningful to say about MMOs. The game mechanics are treated as an afterthought. The player community barely resembles an actual online community. The systems exist only when the plot needs them and disappear when they become inconvenient. As a result, the series ends up feeling less like a story written by someone who loves MMOs and more like a story written by someone looking at them from the outside. It captures the appearance of an MMO without understanding the culture, the players, or the reasons people become obsessed with these games for years. For a show built entirely around a virtual MMORPG, that's a pretty massive failure. The unique skills feature in Sword Art Online makes absolutely no sense. For starters, it's fundamentally unfair. In an MMO, players expect that important abilities, gear, and progression paths are obtainable by everyone, even if some require more effort than others. That's one of the core ideas behind the genre. If you put in the time, learn the mechanics, and meet the requirements, you should at least have a chance to earn the same rewards as everyone else. Instead, Sword Art Online introduces skills that are apparently reserved for specific individuals. Not because they completed a difficult challenge. Not because they discovered a hidden quest. Not because they achieved something extraordinary. The game simply decides that certain players get access to powerful abilities that nobody else can ever obtain. Imagine playing an MMO where the developers randomly handed one player a class that does twice as much damage as everyone else and then told the rest of the community they could never unlock it under any circumstances. People would be furious. Forums would explode. Players would accuse the developers of favoritism. Entire guilds would complain non-stop. The game would become a laughingstock overnight. The famous dual blade skill is probably the worst example. The game rewards the player with the fastest reaction speed by giving them an exclusive combat ability that nobody else can access. Think about how ridiculous that is. The game identifies the player who's already better than everyone else in a particular category and then gives them an even bigger advantage. That's the exact opposite of good game balance. Real MMOs generally try to avoid creating situations where one player is granted permanent exclusive power over everyone else. Even rare classes, legendary weapons, or difficult achievements are usually designed so that other players can eventually earn them too. The challenge is supposed to be obtaining the reward, not being arbitrarily locked out forever. The unique skills in Sword Art Online don't feel like something designed by a game developer. They feel like something designed by a writer who needed his favorite characters to seem special. Instead of creating interesting mechanics that all players could engage with, the story just invents exclusive powers and hands them to whoever the plot wants to spotlight. It might work as a shortcut for storytelling, but as a MMO design, it's complete nonsense. What makes the unique skills even worse is that the players who receive them don't actually work for them. They're just handed these incredibly powerful abilities for free. That makes absolutely no sense in an MMO. One of the biggest reasons players enjoy MMOs is the sense of progression. You start weak, put in the time, overcome challenges, and earn rewards. The satisfaction comes from knowing you worked for what you have. Whether it's a rare weapon, a difficult title, an endgame mount, or a powerful ability, players expect there to be some kind of effort involved. In Sword Art Online, the unique skills completely skip that process. The game simply decides that certain players are special and grants them exclusive powers that nobody else can obtain. They don't have to complete a legendary quest chain. They don't have to defeat an impossible boss. They don't have to solve some massive mystery hidden within the game world. The reward just appears in their lap. That's terrible game design because it completely disconnects power from achievement. The player isn't being rewarded for something they accomplished. They're being rewarded for existing. The game picks favorites and hands them advantages that the rest of the player base can never earn no matter how much effort they put in. Imagine spending thousands of hours mastering the game, clearing difficult content, and learning every mechanic, only to find out another player has access to a stronger ability simply because the system chose them. Not because they played better. Not because they worked harder. Not because they achieved something you couldn't. They just won a lottery you were never allowed to enter. Any real MMO that tried something like this would be mocked relentlessly. Players hate feeling like their effort doesn't matter. The moment a game starts handing out exclusive power for free, people stop caring about progression because they know the system is rigged. Instead of motivating players to improve, it tells them that success depends on whether the game likes them. The unique skills don't feel like rewards. They feel like plot devices. They're not there because they make sense as game mechanics. They're there because the story wants certain characters to stand out, and the easiest way to do that is to give them special powers they never had to earn. And as stated earlier, the players who receive these unique skills are already among the strongest players in the game. That's what makes the entire system even more ridiculous. They don't need special abilities that make them even stronger. If anything, they're the last people who should be getting them. Good game design usually tries to close the gap between players, not make it even wider. If one player is already outperforming everyone else, the solution isn't to hand them an exclusive power boost that nobody else can access. That's just taking an existing imbalance and making it worse. The dual blade skill is the perfect example. Kirito is already one of the strongest players in the game. He's already ahead of most of the player base in terms of skill, experience, and progression. So what does the game do? It rewards him with a unique combat style that makes him even more powerful. That's backwards. The rich get richer while everyone else gets left behind. It's like a college deciding to give its biggest scholarships to students from wealthy families while ignoring students who are struggling to pay tuition. The people receiving the reward are the ones who need it the least. Meanwhile, the people who could actually benefit from additional support get nothing. Most people would immediately recognize how unfair that system is. The same logic applies here. If a player is already dominating the game, why would the developers give them an exclusive advantage on top of everything they already have? What problem is that supposed to solve? What gameplay purpose does it serve? The answer is none. It only exists because the story wants certain characters to look cool. A real MMO developer would be terrified of implementing a system like this. Players already complain when top guilds get too much of an advantage. They already complain when powerful players pull too far ahead of everyone else. The last thing any developer would do is create a mechanic specifically designed to make the strongest players even stronger. The unique skills don't reward hard work. They don't encourage competition. They don't create interesting gameplay. All they do is concentrate even more power in the hands of players who were already winning. That's not balance. That's not good design. It's favoritism disguised as a game mechanic. Unique skills also completely destroy any sense of fairness in PvP. How are players without unique skills supposed to stand a chance against players who have them? The entire system creates a situation where some players enter a fight with exclusive abilities that their opponents can never obtain, learn, or practice themselves. One of the most important parts of PvP is that both sides have access to the same basic tools. One player might be more skilled, better geared, or more knowledgeable, but everyone should be playing by the same rules. When someone loses, they should be able to look at the fight and think, I could have played that better. Unique skills throw that idea out the window. Instead, Sword Art Online creates a system where certain players have abilities that nobody else can use. That means they're operating under a completely different set of rules from everyone else. At that point, the fight isn't being decided purely by player skill anymore. It's being influenced by advantages that only one side is allowed to have. It gets even worse when you consider that these skills are supposedly unique. How exactly are players supposed to prepare for something they've never encountered before? In most competitive games, players learn by experience. They fight certain classes, abilities, and strategies over and over until they understand how to counter them. That's how a healthy PvP environment develops. But if an ability only exists on a single player, where is that experience supposed to come from? How do you practice against it? How do you develop counterplay? How do you learn its weaknesses? You can't. The first time you see it might be the moment it's already killing you. Imagine playing a competitive game where one player has access to secret abilities that aren't available to anyone else. Nobody knows exactly what they do, nobody can test them, and nobody can use them themselves. Most players wouldn't call that competition. They call it cheating. That's another reason the unique skills feel less like MMO mechanics and more like story devices. They're designed to make certain characters look impressive, not to create a balanced or believable game. In a real MMO, developers spend enormous amounts of time trying to make PvP fair enough that players feel their victories and defeats are earned. Sword Art Online goes in the opposite direction by giving a handful of players exclusive powers and expecting everyone else to somehow compete with them. The result is a PvP system that feels fundamentally broken. You're not fighting another player on equal terms. You're fighting a player who was handed advantages that you can never obtain and can barely even understand. That's not competitive balance. That's a rigged match. Players with unique skills would absolutely dominate PvP, and it wouldn't take long for the rest of the player base to get sick of it. If a handful of players have access to powerful abilities that nobody else can obtain, they're naturally going to have a massive advantage in competitive fights. At first, players would probably be curious. They'd want to see the skills in action and figure out how they work. But that curiosity would quickly turn into frustration once people realized there was no way to get those abilities themselves. Every loss against a unique skill user would feel less like a fair defeat and more like the game stacking the deck against them. The complaints would be non-stop. Forums would be flooded with angry posts. Players would accuse the developers of terrible balancing. Guilds would argue about it constantly. Every PvP discussion would eventually come back to the same question. Why are certain players allowed to have exclusive powers that the rest of us can never access? The worst part is that there wouldn't even be a real solution. Normally, when players think something is overpowered, they can grind for it themselves, develop counters, or adapt their strategies. Unique skills remove all of those options. You can't earn them. You can't copy them. You can't build toward them. You're simply locked out forever. That creates a feeling of hopelessness, and hopelessness is one of the fastest ways to kill a competitive game. People are willing to lose when they believe they can improve. They're willing to grind when they believe there's a reward waiting at the end. They're willing to practice when they think they can eventually compete with the best players. But when the game tells them that certain advantages are permanently reserved for other people, many players stop trying altogether. Eventually, a lot of players would just quit. Why spend hundreds or thousands of hours mastering a game when some opponents are walking around with exclusive powers you'll never be allowed to have? Most players wouldn't see that as a challenge. They'd see it as proof that the game is fundamentally unfair. Any real MMO that implemented a system like this would face a massive backlash. The community would tear it apart, the developers would be pressured to change it, and if they refused, players would leave. That's why the unique skills in Sword Art Online feel so unrealistic. They're the kind of idea that sounds cool in a story but would be a complete disaster in an actual MMO. Players with unique skills wouldn't just dominate PvP. They'd dominate boss fights too, which creates an entirely different set of problems for the game. We already saw this happen with Kirito and the Gleam Eyes fight. The moment he reveals dual blades, he suddenly becomes the center of the entire battle. What was supposed to be a massive raid encounter involving multiple players turns into a showcase for one guy with a special ability. And that's exactly the problem. MMOs are usually designed around teamwork. Different players bring different strengths, and success comes from coordination. Tanks absorb damage, healers keep the group alive, damage dealers focus on killing the boss, and everyone has a role to play. The point is that the group succeeds together. Unique skills completely undermine that idea. If one player has access to an exclusive ability that's significantly stronger than what everyone else can use, that player naturally becomes more important than the rest of the raid. The more powerful the skill is, the more the encounter revolves around them. Imagine being a regular player in Sword Art Online. You've spent months grinding levels, upgrading gear, and learning boss mechanics. Then a player with a unique skill shows up and starts doing more damage than everyone else combined. Suddenly your contribution doesn't feel nearly as important. Over time, guilds would start prioritizing players with unique skills above everyone else. Raid groups would desperately try to recruit them. Floor-clearing strategies would be built around them. Boss encounters would become less about teamwork and more about whether your group happened to have one of the chosen players. That's terrible for a multiplayer game. One of the biggest goals of MMO design is making players feel like their participation matters. Even if someone isn't the strongest player in the raid, they should still feel like they're contributing to the group's success. Unique skills threaten that by concentrating too much power in the hands of a few individuals. The Gleam Eyes fight is the perfect example because it accidentally demonstrates why the system is so broken. Instead of highlighting the strength of the raid group, it highlights the strength of the one player who has access to a special ability that nobody else can obtain. The focus shifts away from teamwork and toward the exclusive advantage that only one person possesses. And if that's possible against one boss, imagine what would happen across the entire game. Every major guild would be competing for the same handful of players. Every raid would revolve around them. Every floor-clearing operation would depend on them. Players without unique skills would constantly feel like second-class participants compared to the chosen few. That's not healthy game design. That's creating a hierarchy where a tiny group of players gets to have a completely different experience from everyone else. In a real MMO, that would lead to resentment, drama, and endless complaints from the community. The Gleam Eyes fight wasn't proof that dual blades was an awesome mechanic. If anything, it was proof of why the mechanic never should have existed in the first place. It showed exactly what happens when one player is handed a level of power that nobody else is allowed to have. The encounter stops being about the group and starts being about them. The fact that the author thought this was a good idea says a lot about how little he understands MMO design. The unique skills system isn't a small mistake or a minor balancing issue. It's the kind of idea that immediately raises red flags for anyone who spent a significant amount of time playing online games. The problems aren't hidden. You don't need years of game development experience to spot them. The unfairness is obvious. The balance issues are obvious. The impact on PvP is obvious. The effect on player motivation is obvious. These are the kinds of questions that players would be asking within minutes of learning how the system works. That's what makes it so baffling. The unique skills aren't some complicated mechanic that accidentally created unforeseen problems. The problems are built directly into the concept itself. The moment you tell players that a handful of people get exclusive powers that nobody else can ever obtain, you've already created a system that would cause endless complaints and frustration. What's even more frustrating is that the story presents these skills as something exciting and impressive instead of acknowledging how disastrous they would be in an actual game. The audience is expected to cheer when certain characters receive these exclusive abilities, but anyone looking at the system from a game design perspective is left wondering how such a terrible idea ever made it into the game in the first place. The entire mechanic feels less like something created by a developer who understands MMOs and more like something created by a writer who needed an easy way to make certain characters seem special. Instead of earning their status through well-designed systems, they're simply handed powers that nobody else is allowed to have. When one of the central mechanics of your fictional MMO falls apart the moment players start thinking about it, that's not a sign of clever design. It's a sign that very little thought was put into how real players would react to it. And the fact that the author apparently saw no problem with any of this is a perfect example of why the game design in Sword Art Online feels so amateurish from start to finish. Boss fights shouldn't be soloable in the first place. They're supposed to be these massive group challenges that require coordination, planning, and teamwork. That's the entire point of having bosses in an MMO. When developers create major raid bosses, they're usually designed around the idea that multiple players will be fighting them together. One player handles aggro, another keeps the party healed. Damage dealers focus on specific mechanics. Everyone has a job to do. The challenge comes from getting a large group of people to work together under pressure. That's what makes boss victories satisfying. It's not just about one person being strong. It's about a group overcoming something that none of them could defeat alone. The Gleam Eyes fight completely undermines that idea. This is supposed to be one of the strongest bosses players have encountered so far. The entire reason a raid group exists is because these enemies are too dangerous for individual players to handle. Yet the moment Kirito activates dual blades, the fight suddenly turns into something that can apparently be solved by one guy swinging his swords fast enough. Think about how absurd that is. If a boss can be soloed by a single player with the right skill, then why is everyone bothering with raid groups at all? Why are dozens of players risking their lives in coordinated assaults if one person can potentially do the job themselves? The existence of a player capable of soloing major raid bosses would completely change the game's meta overnight. Guilds wouldn't be focused on building balanced teams. They'd be focused on finding people with abilities strong enough to carry encounters. Players wouldn't be discussing group strategies. They'd be discussing which overpowered individuals could clear content the fastest. The entire focus of progression would shift away from teamwork and toward creating the strongest possible solo characters. That's the exact opposite of what an MMO is supposed to encourage. Massive multiplayer games are built around cooperation. The genre exists because people enjoy tackling challenges together. If your most important content can be bypassed by a handful of overpowered players, then you're actively undermining one of the main reasons people play MMOs in the first place. And before someone says that Kirito barely survived the fight, that's not really the point. The problem is that it was even possible at all. The moment a player can walk into a major raid encounter and become more effective than an entire group of people, something has gone horribly wrong with the game's balance. A boss fight should be a test of the raid. In Sword Art Online, it often feels like a test of whether the right overpowered protagonist showed up. That's not a massive group challenge. That's a glorified showcase for a broken character build. It gets even more ridiculous when you remember that the series claims the game has an unlimited number of skills available to players, with magic being the major exception. If that's the case, then how is anyone so certain that these so-called unique skills are actually unique? Think about it for a second. In a game with countless skills, hidden mechanics, and unexplored content, players should constantly be discovering new things. That's especially true in an MMO with thousands of players searching every corner of the world for secrets. People would be experimenting non-stop, testing strange combinations, sharing discoveries, and trying to find abilities nobody had seen before. So when the game suddenly declares that a skill is completely unique and belongs to one person, how exactly does anyone know that? Have all possible skill combinations already been tested? Has every hidden mechanic already been discovered? Have players somehow explored every system in the game? That seems impossible, especially considering how large Sword Art Online is supposed to be. The whole idea contradicts the way the game is described. On one hand, we're told this is a massive world filled with endless possibilities. On the other hand, the game somehow knows with absolute certainty that only one player can possess a certain ability. The more you think about it, the less sense it makes. And from the perspective of the players, it should be even more confusing. Imagine hearing that another player has a unique skill in a game with thousands of unexplored features. Most people's first reaction wouldn't be, "Wow, that skill must truly be one of a kind." Their reaction would be, "How do you know?" They'd assume there were other hidden skills out there waiting to be discovered. In real MMOs, players constantly uncover mechanics that developers never expected people to find. Entire communities are built around data mining, testing, theory crafting, and hunting for secrets. If Sword Art Online really has an enormous number of skills and systems, players would be questioning every claim about uniqueness. They'd be searching for alternatives, looking for hidden requirements, and trying to prove that the skills weren't actually exclusive. Instead, the story just expects everyone to accept the idea without question. It never really explains how anyone can confidently label these abilities as unique in a game that's supposedly overflowing with undiscovered content. Once again, it feels less like a believable MMO mechanic and more like a plot device that only exists because the story needs certain characters to be special. The idea of unique skills becomes even harder to defend when you remember that Sword Art Online supposedly contains an enormous, unlimited number of skills. If the game really has that much variety, then there should naturally be countless variations of the same basic concepts. Take dual blades as an example. Developers generally try to give players choices rather than locking an entire playstyle behind a single weapon category. Otherwise, the game ends up arbitrarily favoring one group of players over everyone else. The same logic applies to the other unique skills. If the game is truly packed with endless skills and hidden mechanics, then there should be entire families of related abilities. Every supposedly unique concept should have alternatives, variations, upgrades, downgrades, and different versions built around different weapons or playstyles. Instead, Sword Art Online acts like dual blades is some revolutionary idea that exists completely by itself. But dual wielding isn't some incredibly specific concept. It's one of the most obvious combat styles imaginable. If a developer thought of letting players use two swords, why wouldn't they think of letting players use two axes, or two daggers, or two hammers? The answer is that the skill wasn't designed to make sense as part of a game system. It was designed to make Kirito stand out from everyone else. The story needed a flashy ability that would instantly make him look special, so it created one and then pretended it was unique. But the more you think about the game's own rules, the less believable that becomes. In a world with nearly unlimited skills, a dual-wielding sword skill shouldn't be some mythical exception. It should be one option among hundreds of similar weapon specializations. The fact that the story treats it as this irreplaceable, one-of-a-kind ability only highlights how little thought was put into the actual game design behind it. The funniest part is that the show accidentally undermines its own argument. We're told that dual blades is this incredible, unique skill because it allows a player to fight with two weapons at once. Yet we literally see a member of Titan's Hand running around with two axes. That immediately raises a huge question. If players can already equip and fight with two axes, then what exactly is supposed to be so unique about dual blades? The series wants the audience to believe that dual wielding is some legendary ability reserved for a single player, but the moment another character is shown using two weapons, the whole thing starts falling apart. The obvious conclusion is that dual wielding itself isn't unique at all. Other players are clearly capable of holding and using multiple weapons. So now we're left trying to figure out where the uniqueness actually comes from. Is it the ability to equip two weapons? Apparently not, because we've already seen someone else doing that. Is it a specific combat style? Is it a special set of attacks? Is it just a collection of sword skills? The show never really makes this clear. And that's a problem because the distinction matters. If the special part of dual blades is simply that it gives access to unique attack animations or skill combinations, then it's not some revolutionary gameplay mechanic. It's basically just a specialized weapon skill tree. MMOs are filled with those. In fact, seeing another player use two axes should make everyone question why dual blades is treated as such a big deal in the first place. If dual weapon combat already exists in the game, then the skill isn't introducing a completely new way to play. It's just a more advanced version of something players are already doing. That brings us right back to the original problem. In a game that's supposedly packed with countless skills and weapon specializations, why would this one particular version be considered uniquely special? If two axes are allowed, then why not a dedicated dual axes skill? Why not dual daggers? Why not dozens of other variations built around different weapons? The existence of players already fighting with two weapons completely destroys the idea that dual blades is some one-of-a-kind concept. Instead of making the skill look impressive, it makes it look like just another combat specialization that the story desperately wants the audience to think is more important than it really is. Once again, the mechanic feels less like something designed by a game developer and more like something designed by a writer trying to make his main character look cooler than everyone else. The moment you start comparing it to what other players in the game are already capable of doing, the illusion starts to crack. And then there's the claim that the game contains an unlimited number of skills. That's one of those statements that sounds impressive until you spend 5 seconds thinking about it. How exactly would that even work? Games don't magically create endless amounts of content out of thin air. Every skill needs animations, balance testing, interactions with other systems, damage values, requirements, restrictions, and countless other details. Even the largest MMOs ever made have limits because somebody actually has to design and implement all of that content. So when Sword Art Online talks about having an unlimited number of skills, it immediately raises a ton of questions. Who made them? When were they made? How were they tested? How do they interact with every other skill in the game? How do the developers even know they won't completely break combat? The only explanation that makes any sense is that most of these skills would have to be generated automatically by some kind of AI system. But that creates an entirely different problem. If the game is constantly generating skills on its own, then most of them would probably be garbage. Anyone who's spent time with procedurally generated content knows that quantity doesn't automatically mean quality. Just because a system can create thousands of things doesn't mean those things are interesting, balanced, or useful. In reality, you'd probably end up with countless redundant skills, broken skills, overpowered skills, underpowered skills, and skills that nobody would ever use. The game would be flooded with junk. And that's before you even consider balance. MMO developers struggle to balance a few dozen classes and abilities. Sword Art Online supposedly has an endless number of skills. That would be a balancing nightmare beyond anything seen in gaming history. There would be exploits everywhere. Players would constantly discover absurd combinations that completely shatter the game's intended design. Ironically, the existence of unlimited skills makes the unique skill system look even dumber. If the game can supposedly generate endless combat abilities, then why are players acting like dual blades is some impossible miracle? In a system with unlimited skills, there should be countless abilities that are just as powerful, just as rare, and just as unusual. Instead, the story wants you to believe both things at the same time. It wants you to believe the game has practically infinite skills, while also insisting that a handful of special abilities are so unique and important that nobody else could ever have anything comparable. Those ideas don't fit together. The more the series talks about its game systems, the more they sound like random cool-sounding concepts thrown together without any thought about how they would actually function in a real MMO. When you really think about it, the unlimited skills concept makes even less sense than the unique skills. At least unique skills have a simple explanation, even if it's a terrible one. The game arbitrarily picks certain players and gives them exclusive abilities. It's awful game design, but you can at least understand what the system is supposed to be doing. The unlimited skills concept is a completely different level of nonsense because it creates endless questions that the series never even attempts to answer. For starters, what does unlimited actually mean? Is there literally no cap on the number of skills in the game? Are new skills constantly being created? So where are they coming from? Who designed them? Who tested them? How are they balanced? How are players discovering them? The moment you start asking basic questions, the entire idea starts collapsing. The problem is that game systems need structure. MMOs aren't just giant piles of random abilities. They're carefully designed collections of mechanics that are supposed to interact with one another in predictable ways. Every new skill affects combat balance, character progression, itemization, PvP, boss encounters, and countless other systems. Now imagine trying to maintain that balance with an endless number of abilities. You couldn't. No developer could. No matter how advanced the technology is, there would be an astronomical number of interactions to account for. Players would constantly discover combinations that break the game in half. Entire sections of content would become trivial overnight. Some skills would be useless. Others would be absurdly overpowered. The game would be a complete disaster. And that's assuming the skills are even worth having in the first place. If most of them are generated automatically, then the vast majority would probably be repetitive variations of existing abilities. Different names, slightly different numbers, slightly different effects. The game might technically have endless skills, but most players would only care about the handful that are actually useful, which makes the entire concept pointless. 1,000,000 bad skills aren't more impressive than 100 well-designed ones. What's funny is that Sword Art Online never seems interested in exploring any of these problems. The phrase unlimited skills is thrown out because it sounds cool and makes the game seem massive. But the more you analyze it, the less believable it becomes. Instead of making the world feel deeper, it exposes how little thought was put into the actual mechanics. The unique skill system is bad because it's unfair. The unlimited skill system is bad because it barely functions as a concept. One is terrible game design. The other feels like it wasn't really thought through at all. That's why, when you break everything down, the unlimited skills idea might actually be the more ridiculous of the two. The more you examine these ideas, the more it feels like the writer never gave them a second thought. He came up with concepts that sounded cool in the moment, threw them into the story, and never stopped to consider what their existence would mean for the game's world, balance, or internal logic. That's really the core problem with Sword Art Online's game design. Almost none of it feels like it was built from the ground up as an actual MMO. It feels like a collection of cool-sounding ideas that were added because they would create exciting scenes. Dual-wielding swords sounds cool. Unique skills sound cool. Unlimited skills sound cool. The problem is that sounding cool and making sense are two completely different things. The moment you start asking follow-up questions, the cracks begin to show. How does an unlimited skill system function? How are those skills created? How are they balanced? Why are some skills unique? Why would developers intentionally create exclusive powers? How does PvP survive in a system like this? How do players compete with abilities they can never obtain? Why are the strongest players the ones receiving the biggest advantages? These aren't obscure questions that only hardcore MMO fans would ask. They're basic questions that naturally come from the systems the story itself introduces. Yet the series rarely seems interested in answering them. Instead, it feels like the writer's thought process stopped at, "Wouldn't this be awesome?" Once the answer was yes, the idea got added to the story. Whether it fit into the larger game world was apparently someone else's problem. That's why so many of Sword Art Online's mechanics start falling apart under scrutiny. They weren't designed as parts of a functioning game. They were designed as tools to create dramatic moments. The game exists to serve the story, not to function as a believable MMO. Normally, that's not necessarily a problem. Plenty of stories take shortcuts. But Sword Art Online constantly asks the audience to take its game world seriously. It wants viewers to believe Sword Art Online is this revolutionary virtual MMORPG with deep systems and realistic mechanics. The problem is that the more attention you pay to those systems, the more they resemble a pile of disconnected ideas held together by wishful thinking. A well-thought-out fictional game should become more convincing the more you analyze it. You should discover clever details and appreciate how different mechanics fit together. Sword Art Online has the opposite effect. The more you think about it, the worse it gets. Every answer creates 3 new questions. Every mechanic introduces new contradictions. Every attempt to make the world seem larger ends up making it less believable. And that's why it feels like so much of the game's design was never properly thought through. The writer wasn't asking whether these ideas would make sense months or years down the line. He was asking whether they sounded cool right now. Unfortunately, those are not the same thing, and Sword Art Online is full of mechanics that prove it. Any real MMO player would take one look at this broken mess of a skill system and immediately notice the problems. You wouldn't need to spend weeks analyzing spreadsheets or digging through game files. Most of the issues are obvious the moment someone explains how the system works. Tell an MMO player that certain people get exclusive skills nobody else can ever obtain, and they'll immediately start asking questions. How is that balanced? What happens in PvP? Why would developers intentionally lock powerful abilities behind a system that most players can never access? What incentive do other players have to keep competing? Tell them the game has an unlimited number of skills, and the questions get even worse. How are they created? How are they tested? How are they balanced? How does the game prevent completely broken combinations? How does anyone keep track of all of this? These are the kinds of concerns MMO players naturally think about because they've spent years watching real games deal with these exact problems. They've seen overpowered classes ruin PvP. They've seen developers struggle to balance far simpler systems. They've seen entire communities explode in outrage over issues much smaller than the ones Sword Art Online presents as normal. That's why the game feels so disconnected from actual MMO culture. The series introduces mechanics that would cause non-stop controversy in any real online game, yet the player base barely seems to react. Instead of endless complaints, forum wars, guild arguments, and demands for changes, everyone mostly accepts these systems as if they're perfectly reasonable. That alone should tell you something is wrong. Real MMO players are some of the most obsessive people in gaming. They analyze every mechanic, test every system, optimize every build, and complain about every imbalance. Entire communities are built around finding flaws in game design. If a real MMO introduced even half of Sword Art Online's systems, players would tear them apart within days. The unique skills would be called unfair. The unlimited skills would be called impossible to balance. The PvP would be called a joke. The progression system would be criticized non-stop. Every forum, guild chat, and discussion board would be flooded with arguments about how badly designed everything is. Yet Sword Art Online acts like these mechanics are impressive innovations instead of disasters waiting to happen. That's why so many MMO players have trouble taking the game's design seriously. They're looking at systems that would cause absolute chaos in reality while the story keeps insisting they're revolutionary. The disconnect is impossible to ignore. To someone unfamiliar with MMOs, these ideas might sound exciting. To someone who's actually played them, they sound like the kinds of mistakes developers spend years trying to avoid. The moment an experienced MMO player starts thinking about how these systems would function in practice, the entire illusion starts falling apart. Sword Art Online mainly appeals to people who don't play MMOs, because anyone with significant MMO experience is going to start noticing problems almost immediately. On the surface, the show looks like it's made for MMO fans. It's filled with guilds, raids, bosses, skills, levels, player killers, rare items, and all the usual MMO buzzwords. To someone unfamiliar with the genre, that can make it seem authentic. It looks like a deep dive into online gaming culture. But the moment an actual MMO player starts examining how any of these systems work, the illusion begins to fall apart. The game balance makes no sense. The progression systems make no sense. The unique skills make no sense. The PvP balance is a disaster. The boss design is questionable. The player behavior barely resembles that of a real MMO community. The more experience someone has with online games, the more obvious these problems become. That's why so many discussions praising Sword Art Online tend to focus on things other than the MMO aspects. People talk about the action scenes. They talk about the romance. They talk about the animation, the music, or the characters. What they rarely do is praise Sword Art Online as a well-designed MMO, because that's where the series is at its weakest. An experienced MMO player can't help but ask questions. Why would developers create unique skills? Why would they give the strongest players even more advantages? Why can major bosses be nearly soloed? How does an unlimited skill system function? How is any of this balanced? And once those questions start piling up, the entire game world starts looking less like an MMO and more like a fantasy story wearing MMO-themed clothing. That's not to say that every MMO player hates Sword Art Online or that nobody can enjoy it. Plenty of people enjoy it for reasons unrelated to the game design. But if the series is being judged specifically as a depiction of an MMORPG, that's where it runs into trouble. The irony is that Sword Art Online is often marketed as this ultimate MMO anime, yet many of the people most likely to be frustrated by it are MMO players themselves. The audience most familiar with the genre is also the audience most likely to notice how little the series understands it. In the end, Sword Art Online doesn't feel like it was written for MMO players. It feels like it was written for people who like the idea of MMOs but don't know enough about them to question what they're seeing. That's why so many of its systems can sound impressive at first glance while completely falling apart the moment you start thinking about how they would work in an actual game. I'm sure the Sword Art Online fans are going to get angry at me for this video, but I honestly don't care. At some point, criticism has to be based on what's actually in the show, not on how much people like it. If someone enjoys Sword Art Online, that's fine. Nobody is stopping them from enjoying it. But enjoying something and pretending it's well-written are two completely different things. The problem is that whenever these issues get pointed out, some fans act like any criticism is a personal attack. Instead of addressing the arguments, they immediately get defensive because they like the series. But liking something doesn't magically make its flaws disappear. The unique skills are still a terrible idea. The game balance is still a disaster. The unlimited skills concept still makes no sense. The MMO mechanics are still laughably bad. None of those problems suddenly vanish because people have nostalgic memories of watching the show. What makes this especially frustrating is that a lot of the criticism isn't even complicated. These aren't tiny nitpicks that require hours of analysis to understand. Most of the problems are obvious the moment you stop and think about them for more than a few seconds. If your defense of the series depends on ignoring basic questions about how its game systems function, that's not much of a defense. And honestly, if pointing out these flaws makes some fans angry, so be it. I'd rather be honest about why the game design doesn't work than pretend it's some masterpiece just because it's popular. Popularity isn't proof of quality. Plenty of popular series have major flaws, and Sword Art Online is no exception. At the end of the day, the systems in Sword Art Online don't fall apart because I'm being unfair. They fall apart because they were never very well thought out to begin with. If fans want to be upset about that, they're free to be upset. It doesn't change the fact that the problems are still there. The fans need to grow up and start seeing things for what they actually are instead of what they want them to be. Too many people get so attached to a series that they stop judging it honestly. Every flaw gets excused. Every criticism gets dismissed. Every bad idea gets defended no matter how little sense it makes. At that point, they're not evaluating the show anymore. They're protecting it. The real world doesn't work like that. Just because you like something doesn't mean it's good. Just because a series is popular doesn't mean it's well written. Just because a show had a big impact on you years ago doesn't mean it's immune to criticism. A lot of Sword Art Online fans seem unable to separate their personal feelings from the actual quality of the series. The moment someone points out a flaw, they act like they've been personally attacked. Instead of addressing the criticism, they rush to defend the show at all costs. That's not maturity. That's blind loyalty. A mature fan can admit when something they enjoy has problems. They can acknowledge flaws without feeling threatened by them. They don't need to pretend every decision the author made was brilliant. The reality is that Sword Art Online has a lot of problems, especially when it comes to its MMO design. Pretending those problems don't exist doesn't make them go away. Ignoring criticism doesn't magically fix bad writing. And getting angry at people for pointing out flaws certainly doesn't change the facts. At some point, fans need to stop living in denial and start looking at the series objectively. If they did, they'd realize that many of the things they praise simply don't hold up under scrutiny. The game design is full of holes. The mechanics are poorly thought out. And a lot of the ideas that sound cool at first completely fall apart once you start asking basic questions. That's just reality. Whether people like hearing it or not doesn't really matter. And I don't read YouTube comments anyway, so the fans can scream at me all they want. I'm never going to hear any of it. They can write 10 paragraphs explaining why Dual Blades is secretly genius game design. They can tell me I just don't understand the story. They can accuse me of being a hater. They can type entire essays defending every terrible mechanic in Sword Art Online. It doesn't matter. I'm not reading it. The funny thing is that some people seem to think criticism only counts if the person criticizing something is willing to sit through thousands of angry comments afterward. That's not how it works. The arguments either stand on their own or they don't. And frankly, if the best response someone has is to rage in the comments section instead of actually addressing the points being made, that says more about them than it does about me. The problems with Sword Art Online don't disappear because people get upset. The unique skills are still broken. The unlimited skills still make no sense. The PvP balance is still a joke. The boss design is still questionable. The MMO systems are still a complete mess. 1,000 angry comments won't change any of that. So if fans want to spend their day typing furious responses, they're free to do so. They can argue with their monitor. They can argue with each other. They can convince themselves they won some imaginary debate. Meanwhile, I'll be doing literally anything else. At the end of the day, the criticism remains the same whether people like it or not. And since I don't read the comments, all the outrage in the world is basically shouting into the void as far as I'm concerned. It's honestly baffling to me how anyone can look at Sword Art Online and decide that's the best the genre has to offer when there are so many better alternatives out there. If you want a series that actually feels like it understands MMOs, watch Log Horizon. If you want overpowered characters done better, watch Overlord. If you want a fun game-focused series that actually embraces its mechanics instead of constantly tripping over them, watch Bofuri. All three of those series understand their own premises better than Sword Art Online does. Log Horizon in particular absolutely embarrasses Sword Art Online when it comes to MMO concepts. It spends time exploring guild politics, player economies, raid strategies, social structures, and the consequences of thousands of people being trapped inside a game world. The characters actually think about how the world functions. The setting feels like it was created by people who understand why MMOs are interesting. Meanwhile, Sword Art Online treats most of its game systems like background decoration. Then there's Overlord. It doesn't pretend to be a realistic MMO simulation, but it doesn't need to. The series knows exactly what kind of story it's trying to tell. It isn't constantly trying to convince the audience that its game mechanics are revolutionary. It focuses on world building, power dynamics, and character interactions rather than relying on questionable MMO systems to carry the narrative. And then there's Bofuri, a show that is arguably sillier than Sword Art Online but somehow feels more believable as an online game. At least when Bofuri introduces ridiculous abilities, it usually treats them as the result of strange builds, unintended interactions, or game balance issues. That's something MMO players can actually relate to because weird, overpowered builds show up in real games all the time. What's amazing is that these series manage to be more entertaining while also making more sense. They don't need exclusive Chosen One skills. They don't need unlimited abilities that nobody can explain. They don't need absurdly broken mechanics that would destroy an actual MMO. They work because they understand their own worlds. That's what makes Sword Art Online so frustrating. It's not just that it has problems. It's that there are other series sitting right next to it proving those problems weren't necessary. Other writers have shown that you can tell stories about virtual worlds, MMOs, and overpowered characters without creating a game that falls apart the moment someone starts thinking about it. So when people act like Sword Art Online is some untouchable masterpiece of the genre, I can't help but wonder if they've actually watched anything else. Because once you've seen some of the alternatives, it's hard not to notice just how weak Sword Art Online looks by comparison. Even movies like Ready Player One and Free Guy do a better job with gaming concepts than Sword Art Online, which is honestly pretty embarrassing when you think about it. Neither of those movies is trying to be a realistic MMO simulation. They're not trying to be the ultimate gaming experience. They're not pretending to be detailed explorations of online game design. They're just fun movies built around virtual worlds and gaming culture. And somehow they still feel more believable. Ready Player One understands something that Sword Art Online constantly forgets. Players love finding secrets. The entire movie revolves around people exploring the game world, searching for hidden clues, sharing information, competing with one another, and obsessing over discoveries. That actually feels like something a real gaming community would do. Free Guy understands player behavior better than Sword Art Online does. The players are chaotic, unpredictable, competitive, and constantly doing weird things because that's exactly how real players act in online games. The game world feels populated by actual gamers instead of characters who only exist to move the plot forward. Most importantly, neither movie relies on nonsense systems like exclusive Chosen One powers that only a handful of players can access. Imagine if Ready Player One revealed that one random player had a special ability nobody else could ever obtain because the game simply liked them more. People would immediately call that terrible game design. Imagine if Free Guy introduced a mechanic where the strongest players were given permanent exclusive advantages over everyone else. The audience would laugh at how unfair it was. Yet Sword Art Online does things like this constantly and expects everyone to accept them without question. What's really funny is that both Ready Player One and Free Guy understand the social side of gaming better as well. They understand that games are communities. They're filled with competition, cooperation, rivalries, friendships, and people constantly finding ways to break the rules. That's a huge part of what makes online games interesting. Sword Art Online often feels like it forgets that. For a series supposedly centered around thousands of trapped players, it rarely captures the energy of a real online gaming community. That's why it's so strange that a couple of Hollywood movies can sometimes feel more authentic than an anime whose entire premise revolves around living inside an MMORPG. Neither Ready Player One nor Free Guy is perfect. Both have their own flaws, but at least they understand the basic appeal of online games and the people who play them. That's more than I can say for a lot of Sword Art Online's game design. When movies that aren't even focused on MMO realism end up feeling more believable than a series built entirely around an MMO, that's not exactly a great look for Sword Art Online. So what's the moral of this video? Avoid Sword Art Online. Avoid the garbage game design. Avoid the endless stream of mechanics that sound cool for 5 seconds before completely falling apart the moment you think about them. Avoid the unique skills that destroy balance. Avoid the unlimited skills that make no sense. Avoid the broken PvP. Avoid the boss fights that revolve around overpowered chosen ones instead of teamwork. Avoid a fictional MMO that seems to understand online gaming less than many people who have never even played one. And while you're at it, avoid the fanbase that treats every criticism like a personal attack. If someone enjoys the series, that's their business. But if you're looking for a well-thought-out MMO story, there are far better options available. There are series that actually understand game mechanics. There are series that understand player communities. There are series that put real thought into how their worlds function. Sword Art Online isn't one of them. At the end of the day, the biggest problem isn't that the series has flaws. Every series has flaws. The problem is that so much of Sword Art Online's foundation is built on ideas that don't hold up under even basic scrutiny. The game design is a mess. The balance is a mess. The world building constantly contradicts itself. And the more you analyze it, the worse it gets. So save yourself the headache. Skip Sword Art Online. Watch something better. Play an actual MMO instead. You'll learn more about online games in a single weekend of real gameplay than Sword Art Online manages to teach across its entire runtime. And with that, I'm done. If the fans are angry, they can stay angry. The game design is still terrible, the criticisms are still valid, and no amount of outrage is going to change that. I suffered through Sword Art Online so you don't have to. I sat through the terrible game design. I sat through the broken mechanics. I sat through the nonsense unique skills. I sat through the unlimited skills that somehow make even less sense. I sat through the ridiculous balancing decisions, the questionable world building, and all the other ideas that collapse the moment you spend more than 10 seconds thinking about them. I asked the questions the show never wanted anyone to ask. How does this system work? Why would any developer do that? How is this balanced? Why would players tolerate this? And every time I looked for an answer, I found another problem instead. So consider this video a public service. I willingly walked into this dumpster fire, sorted through the ashes, and came back to report my findings. My conclusion is simple. Save your time. There are better anime. There are better game worlds. There are better stories about MMOs. There are actual MMOs that make more sense than the MMO supposedly designed by a genius in Sword Art Online. You don't need to spend dozens of episodes watching a fictional game repeatedly trip over its own rules just to reach the same conclusion. I've already done that for you. I've suffered through Sword Art Online so you don't have to. You're welcome. Sword Art Online isn't even so bad it's good. That would actually require it to be entertaining in ways the creators never intended. The best so bad it's good shows are fun because they're unintentionally hilarious. They have bizarre writing, ridiculous acting, insane plot twists, or moments so absurd that you can't help but laugh. Sword Art Online doesn't have that charm. Instead, it's mostly frustrating. Rather than being entertainingly bad, it's the kind of bad that makes you stop every few minutes to ask, wait, that doesn't make any sense. The game mechanics are broken. The world building is inconsistent. The balance is a disaster. And instead of becoming funny, it just becomes exhausting. The biggest problem is that the series takes itself completely seriously. It wants you to be impressed by its game design. It wants you to think the unique skills are cool. It wants you to believe Sword Art Online is this incredible virtual world. The problem is that the more seriously the show treats these ideas, the harder it becomes not to notice how ridiculous they are. A true so bad it's good show can be enjoyed ironically. You gather some friends, laugh at the nonsense, and have a great time. Sword Art Online doesn't really work that way because so much of the experience is spent watching the story repeatedly congratulate itself for ideas that don't hold up under even the slightest scrutiny. Instead of laughing, you're usually rolling your eyes. Instead of being shocked by how absurd something is, you're annoyed that the show expects you to accept it without question. That's why I wouldn't even give Sword Art Online the compliment of calling it so bad it's good. Plenty of bad shows earn cult followings because they're entertaining disasters. Sword Art Online is more like a frustrating disaster. The problems aren't fun. They're just problems. The series sits in this awkward middle ground where it's too poorly thought out to take seriously but too self-important to be unintentionally funny. It wants to be viewed as an epic story about a revolutionary MMO, yet it constantly trips over its own rules and mechanics. In a weird way, that almost makes it worse. At least truly terrible shows can provide accidental entertainment. Sword Art Online mostly provides a long list of questions that the writer clearly never bothered to answer. That's why I can't even enjoy it as a train wreck. A train wreck is at least interesting to watch. Sword Art Online is just a mess. This dumpster fire never deserved to be popular. The more I look at Sword Art Online, the harder it is for me to understand how it became one of the most famous anime of its generation. This isn't some misunderstood masterpiece that people unfairly criticize. It's a series built on a foundation of weak game design, questionable writing, and ideas that fall apart the moment anyone starts asking basic questions. What's especially frustrating is that there were already better alternatives. There were stories that understood MMOs better. There were stories with stronger world building. There were stories that put actual thought into their game mechanics. Yet somehow Sword Art Online was the one that exploded in popularity. It's like the anime community was handed a gourmet meal and chose to eat fast food out of a dumpster instead. The series became famous not because it had the best ideas, but because it arrived at the right time with a premise that sounded cool. The idea of being trapped inside a virtual reality game grabbed people's attention immediately. Unfortunately, once you get past that premise, there's not much substance underneath. The game design is a mess. The balance is a mess. The unique skills are a mess. The world building is a mess. And yet people acted like it was the greatest thing ever created. I honestly think a lot of the show's popularity came from viewers who never stopped to think about what they were watching. They saw cool fights, flashy sword skills, and an overpowered main character, and that was enough. Meanwhile, anyone paying attention to the actual mechanics was left wondering how this fictional game managed to function for even a single day. Popularity doesn't automatically mean quality. Something can be successful and still be badly written. Something can have millions of fans and still be full of terrible ideas. Sword Art Online is proof of that. When I look at the series, I don't see an anime that earned its reputation through clever writing or well-designed systems. I see an anime that got lucky with a strong premise and managed to convince a lot of people not to look too closely at what came after. Because once you do look closely, the cracks become impossible to ignore. And the biggest mystery isn't how players survived inside the game. The biggest mystery is how this show became so popular in the first place. That concludes this video, but don't worry, I'm nowhere near finished with Sword Art Online. This series is a gold mine of terrible ideas, broken mechanics, and baffling writing decisions. The more I dig into it, the more problems I find. Every time I think I've reached the bottom of the dumpster, I discover another layer of garbage underneath. So if you're one of the few people who enjoys watching me tear apart this train wreck, there's plenty more coming. We've only scratched the surface of everything wrong with Sword Art Online, and I've got a long list of topics that still need to be covered. There are more broken systems to discuss, more bad game design to analyze, more plot holes to point out, and plenty more reasons why this series never deserved the reputation it got. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next round of Sword Art Online criticism. There will be more rants, more breakdowns, and probably a lot more disbelief at how some of these ideas ever made it into the final product. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, where we'll continue digging through the wreckage that is Sword Art Online.